Companies operating in today's global economy really need to get an understanding of the international geopolitical risk landscape. At Infortal Worldwide, we work with our clients on solving risk before it starts. Welcome to the Riskology podcast, where we're looking at managing business risk globally and really understanding the geopolitical risk landscape.
Welcome back, everyone, to the latest episode of Riskology by Infortal, where we cover the world of risk, geopolitics, economics, and anything that can impact your business, both overseas and here in the U.S. And we've covered a lot of ground, of course, in the past few episodes. Still a lot on the horizon in terms of geopolitics, but we thought we would try and look at the geopolitical landscape through a little bit of a different lens. You know, we're typically focused heavily on compliance, of course, and that's what we help our clients with for the most part. But I think it's important as well to kind of stretch the examination of geopolitics by companies to make sure that we're hitting a few of the areas that I think are relevant as we move forward into 2025, particularly for the CFOs at companies. CFOs are very uniquely positioned within a firm, and geopolitics a lot of times are kind of looked at in a vacuum and may not necessarily feed into what the CFO has on their plate. And that's something we want to examine today, because I think going forward, we're going to see a lot of CFOs that are really getting more involved with understanding and pulling apart the geopolitical risks that really are going to impact the bottom line and the day-to-day work of CFOs. So Ian, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, so by the time you are listening to this, Election Day will have passed, although we are recording this on Election Day. We want to sort of get out of that. So Deloitte had a survey on how geopolitical risk poses unique challenges for CFOs specifically. So we have, let's just put it this way, the world is in flux. There's no stability necessarily on the horizon. So how do you maintain compliance, minimize costs, minimize crisis costs, or the cost of threat mitigation as it relates to geopolitics? So that's kind of where we're at in terms of what's facing boards and CFOs specifically in ways that they weren't before. And there's some takeaways that they offered, like undertake scenario planning, create contingency plans, communicate clearly, and ensure compliance. Now, compliance and communication, they're kind of no-brainers, but in scenario planning and contingency planning, these are a little more complicated because these are not costs that you necessarily need at the moment, but can save you money later. And the fact that this is starting to be recommended is actually pretty telling, because this implies that there's less recourse to mitigate costs and crisis once it actually starts. Like, what happens when you're faced with something that your insurance company is going to take significant amount of time to cover? Maybe you're looking at a specific crisis or a threat that's going to cost unforeseen amounts of money up front, create unforeseen liabilities that you're not planning for. If you have that scenario planning done in advance, then your reaction time is going to be much faster, and you're going to be able to react as threats emerge. So one of the big things that risk mitigation is doing is monitoring, and that's gotten very, very efficient now. You have AI platforms, and you have different sort of tools now that just did not exist previously to mitigate risk, but by its nature, business is risky. So you can't not venture out into the global economy with everything going on. So now you have to sort of swallow that risk and march ahead. How do you mitigate the threats once they emerge? And you got to have those contingency plans in place. So this is kind of like the first step. How do you do that? How would they do that?
Yeah, that's important to mention, the fact that risk monitoring is getting better and better. And, we just attended a conference, the GRC Risk Conference in London, where we met with a lot of service providers that can give you massively complicated and really good systems that can manage different types of risks, create all of the categorization and risk scores that you need. But we've sort of moved past a stage of just monitoring and in the world of geopolitical risk. And you really need to sort of, as you mentioned, do some of that scenario planning to ultimately be able to control the costs or find the most cost-effective solution for your firm. And if you wait until there's a code red situation, if you wait until your risk monitoring apparatus goes crazy, you're most likely going to be spending a lot more than you would have if you had taken the time to really go through some scenario planning and looking holistically across your organization, tapping into your compliance team, tapping into your legal counsel, but then translating that into cost and really making sure that you've thought through some of the different options that might be available. In the risk management space, too, there's sort of a differentiation that I think is important between risk and threats. You don't want to wait until there's an immediate threat to your firm to take action. As you're seeing the risk landscape, as you're studying the risk landscape, you want to start to put together your contingency plans, but also maybe you want to start diversifying. Think about it again from the CFO standpoint. If you're looking at supply chain costs, you're looking at your insurance costs, does it make sense to diversify some now when you look at that overall risk landscape to hedge for that potential threat? And, I think that Ian and I have been talking about this lately, the difference between risk and threat. And you don't want to be making your decisions wholly in the face of a threat.
Yeah, that's the problem is once the threat emerges, the clock is ticking, you're going to be losing revenue. You're going to be losing shareholder value. That crisis emerges, you have a deep fake issue, you have some sort of economic corporate espionage, fractured supply chain, maybe a corruption cost, or maybe it's just tax implications change because of an election or a new government, like what you're seeing in the UK right now, what you saw recently in Italy, what you could see in the US. Once that emerges and everyone starts panicking, your window of opportunity narrows significantly and your path forward narrows significantly in terms of how do you maintain operations, how do you maintain profitability, and how do you handle these crises as they emerge. That's why there's that middle ground between adopting risk. You have your risk tolerance and your risk profile, and then the actual threat. That middle ground is where you actually need to prepare. And a lot of the tools that are used to detect risk don't really do that. Firms like us, we can help with that. But that's something that you need to prepare now. And that's something that if you have a risk officer or a designated risk mitigator in your...
Or even a team, yeah.
Or even a team like Japan, they're integrating intelligence services into their companies. Like right now, the Europeans are starting to do some of this. American companies aren't. They should be. They should have started a couple of years ago.
Yeah, we're starting to see more, but there's still a long way to go.
Yeah.
And again, we've talked about this in the context of compliance, and that's really important because that's where it starts, is making sure you're understanding your risks from a compliance standpoint, from a safety standpoint. And a lot of that's going to be regulatory driven, which, the DOJ has made it clear that national security better be an important factor, especially for the larger companies in the US. And if you run afoul of any of the regulations dealing with national security, you're going to be in a serious spot. And, I still think we're going to see a lot more enforcement in that space. But today, what we're talking about is a little bit different. So that's got to be fundamental, the compliance management. You've got your risk management apparatus in place, but the CFO is uniquely positioned to really understand what the cost implications of the scenarios are, both in your ability to prepare for and manage the risks, but also once the risks translate into threats, what kind of cost situations are you going to be dealing with? And, insurance factors in, location, personnel, a lot of things can factor in there. So if you don't have the CFO at the table involved with that scenario planning and contingency planning, as we mentioned before, then you've only got really half of the puzzle. So really important. And I think we've seen some media coverage of this, but we'll probably start to see more of that in 2025. The fact that, compliance teams, risk departments, they're focused on geopolitics, but how are the CFOs looking at this stuff? And obviously, depending on the industry that you're in, that can look very complex. Ian, I don't know if you have thoughts about sort of the supply chain impact to costs. That's really a significant factor, I think.
Yeah, I mean, supply chains are kind of easier if you think about it, because all you need is some redundancy and backup planning in terms of who your suppliers are. How do you reach your customers? There's like a military term that some people use, like left of bang, before things go south really quickly. That's when you want to be able to take action and be proactive. So if you're worried about supply chains with China could cut off supply chains to a whole host of industries that U.S. companies rely upon. That could happen in an instant if things go with Taiwan. So you need to be thinking now about alternative suppliers. and maybe you pay a slightly marginal cost up front, but you're going to inherit market share in the event that that happens. So maybe you're looking at China plus one or two, or you want to look at outside of Southeast Asia, for example. Or if you want to hedge against different taxation risks, et cetera, you need to look at how to position yourself so that you're resilient and flexible in light of threats that emerge, because threats will emerge. It's inevitable. And detecting risk, like you've already adopted the risk. So that's kind of that middle.
This is really that next step. Yeah. And, the financial analysis and forecasting really takes geopolitical risk analysis to the next level. Because what's it all for if it's just monitoring for threats and then reacting? I think we've moved past that. There may have been a time where a lot of firms could get away with that and it was more focused on safety, but the impact to the bottom line is just too significant to ignore. So it's got to be factored into your financial planning and your financial forecasting. And I think the firms that are starting to do that more are really ahead of the competition. I know financial institutions sort of have a leg up because they've got the deep bench in terms of expertise to do this type of work. But you really can, depending on what your risk profile looks like, run some financial modeling, some financial forecasting to at least have a contingency plan in place. And that'll put you ahead of most of the competition.
I mean, intelligence matters.
Yeah. Going back to what we've said in the past about intelligence and really harnessing the power of business intelligence, again, you want to make sure that that information and that intelligence that you've got coming in is going across the firm. So it's not just sitting with your risk team. It's not just sitting with compliance. But does your CFO know what's going on and have they factored that in? Because if not, then, your calculations may be significantly off. And so again, when you think about harnessing business intelligence and the intelligence collection techniques that we've discussed in the past, this is another avenue where you want to make sure that there's an off-ramp for that intelligence for the CFO and the CFO staff. Sometimes you do need some outside sort of support or facilitation to really coordinate those planning sessions and those strategic planning sessions. That's definitely something we look at with our clients. But you've got to really make sure that, again, that intelligence is being used across the firm if you really want to benefit. And I think we'll see more of that. And we'll see more coverage of that in the new year because, as we mentioned, it's just never a dull moment in terms of geopolitics. All right. So thanks again for joining us. We'll see you next time at Riskology.